Today we're taking a look at the adventure module for D&D 5th edition, Hoard of the Dragon Queen.
Well met, travelers. I'm Monty Martin.
And I'm McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes.
So today we're going to be taking a look at the first hardcover adventure module for D&D 5th edition, Hoard of the Dragon Queen.
Yeah, this was the first module that was put out. It's part one of two parts on the Tyranny of Dragons storyline, the sequel to this being Rise of Tiamat. Hoard of the Dragon Queen was written by Wolfgang Bauer and Steve Winter, and it's a complete 1 to about level 7-8 campaign.
Yeah.
It does have a pretty satisfying conclusion to it, but it is meant to be run along part 2, which is Rise of Tiamat.
So why don't we dig in? So in this campaign, your players go head-to-head against the sinister cult of the dragon, who are plotting some evil scheme to bring upon a dragon apocalypse.
Yeah, it's a pretty exciting adventure in terms of the scope. You're going to be traveling across the entirety of the Sword Coast in the Forgotten Realms, fighting against half-dragons, draconic minions, and really doing a fair bit of cloak and dagger kind of espionage as well.
Yeah, there is a lot of kind of spy type stuff going on in this, where you actually have to track the cult across great distances, trying to figure out what you can to try to uncover what their plot is and where they're operating out of.
Now, Kelly and I have actually played through Hoard of the Dragon Queen. Kelly ran the entire module for us, and I had the experience of playing in that campaign as a player. So we've got a couple thoughts about how this module feels and a few suggestions about what to kind of do with it if you are going to run it in your game.
One thing that I would start off with is the opening chapter is, in my opinion, an amazing opening to a campaign, where it just throws you right into the deep end with something that actually, I will say, can be quite difficult for level 1 players.
It's really intimidating. The beginning scenes of Hoard of the Dragon Queen involve a small village under attack by the cult directly. So as players, we were fighting against kobolds and cultists. We had this huge duel in front of the town's keep with a half-dragon. But in the midst of this battle, there's actually an adult blue dragon flying around attacking the town, which is a little bit scary for first-level players because you cannot fight an adult blue dragon at first level.
What I will say is, as a DM, running the blue dragon in the opening act, I had him more as a presence to terrify, and I had him there to kind of wipe out several NPCs. But I didn't want him to wipe out the whole party, because that would be not a very fun way to start. But he was still there, and I find that the opening act really kind of drives home the fact that the cult is not something to be messed around with.
Yeah, they seemed like a pretty competent set of foes, and the villains ended up being pretty interesting in the end, at least the way that you portrayed them throughout the campaign. I think that it did strike me as a campaign once we ran it and I read through the whole module. It struck me as one that required a lot of work from the Dungeon Master to really fill in the details. I was really surprised when I read over the campaign about how much you'd added to the game. There's a lot of great resources online that we found to really embellish the module.
Yeah, I read a lot of different articles online about Hoard of the Dragon Queen and kind of took bits and pieces from all of them to really help smooth out the story. One thing that you did just mention is the villains in this campaign. Some of them are very well thought out, but some of them just seem to be dropped in later on in the campaign, and you're supposed to care about these villains. But what I actually tried to do is I tried to reference them early on. I tried to have notes and letters and leads guiding the party to fear or hate these villains, so that by the time that they ended up running into them, there was already an established connection between the party and these villains.
Yeah, it really added a sense of urgency into the campaign, especially at parts in it that can very much drag out. there is a very long section in this module that has the party traveling all the way up the Sword Coast over several months. And I have to say, as hard as Kelly worked on this section of the campaign, it was just too long.
Yeah.
And from a player's point of view, I just wanted to skip over like huge swaths of it. So use your discretion as a dungeon master. I think that that's my best advice that I can give for anyone running this module, is that because it's been out for a little while and a lot of people have run it, there's a huge amount of knowledge and resources that you can draw on to make it a lot better than what's printed in the module itself. There's just huge swaths of information that are completely omitted from the book. For example, there's really not much info about what is in the iconic cities of the Sword Coast, like Baldur's Gate and Waterdeep and Neverwinter, which you visit in the campaign, but you pretty much need like the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide or one of the old copies of the Forgotten Realm campaign setting as a DM to actually know who the major players are in these cities. The module doesn't give you any of that information.
I will say that when I was running it, I did have to do a large amount of research into those cities to really fill them out and make them come alive. When you eventually reach Waterdeep for the first time, the campaign just has you go from one end of it to the other. And I had to really come up with a way to make that interesting. So the book kind of glazes over that. I will also say with that chapter 4, the long stretch of road, the book gives you a large number of possible things that you can run and a whole slew of different characters, NPCs, to have traveling with them. I tried to run too much of it. Pick and choose just a few of your favorite NPCs and a few of your favorite scenarios and pepper them in, but don't do what I did, which is make that chapter 4, I think it ended up lasting well over 3 months for our group, and it was just too long for one chapter of the campaign.
Especially compared to the opening, which is fantastic, and the tail end of the campaign, which lets you infiltrate a pair of castles and a hunting lodge, where the players, once they arrive at those sites, have a lot more freedom of how to negotiate with the different inhabitants in those locations, choose how they want to approach them, whereas this really long stretch in the middle is very, very linear in its approach. So I would say that for anyone running this module, shorten that middle part a lot so that you can get to those really big open-ended sections of the module. Because I think a lot of people that look at this module and be like, this is really, really linear. It's not once the players get to actually figure out how we're going to attack this castle.
Speaking of, Chapter 6 of this campaign features a magnificent setting of a swamp castle. And one thing that I highly recommend for anybody running this campaign, and something that I actually really, really enjoyed, was I read several articles on that swamp and on the inhabitants of the swamp, mainly a black dragon that lives in the swamp that is mentioned in the campaign, but it never really tells you that you need to include the dragon. I highly recommend reading up on that dragon and including it, because it actually became a driving force for that chapter of the campaign, and it actually made the castle much more interesting. The castle itself is filled with low-level creatures that are quite easy to trample over, but also kind of boring if you're going in room after room of low-level creatures. So what I ended up doing is making it so that it became more of a revolt between the several different factions within that castle, and I used the dragon as a driving force to guide the players to start that revolt.
I will say on that note as well, in terms of the combat encounters themselves, I found that the difficulty of the combat encounter specifically varied quite widely, where sometimes you would be fighting against hordes and hordes of very easy to defeat enemies, and then all of a sudden the module would drop you in front of a overwhelmingly difficult foe. You can find stories online of people encountering a random inn filled with assassins that wipe their party to the floor because they're only second or third level. Be aware of these pitfalls as a DM, but don't be afraid of them at the same time. It is really important that players do encounter situations that they can't just steamroll. And one of the cool things about this module is actually encountering really, really powerful dragons, giants, and cultists that the players have to think creatively about how to overcome. It's just that don't wield those really iconic characters in the campaign like mallets to just bash over the head of your players.
Yeah, I will say that the beginning and the end of this campaign both present a sizable difficulty challenge for the party. So you want to try to run that in a way that threatens the party with the possibility of death, but you may not want to wipe out the whole party right away at the very beginning. And the ending chapter actually is a little imbalanced, and I've read a lot of reports of that online about how this campaign module was actually written before the monster manual was released, so things were not fully finalized. So just be aware of that as you're reading through it. But the story itself is fantastic, the setting is great, and I've had so much fun running it.
Yeah, so to summarize, Hoard of the Dragon Queen is a pretty good module, but it's one that as a dungeon master, you're probably going to have to use it as a skeleton to build on top of. In this way, it's actually a really great campaign for a dungeon master that's bridging the gap between completely running a module on your own and creating your own homebrew. So if you want something that you can kind of put a lot of your own ideas on, that actually really kind of requires you to put your own ideas onto, Hoard of the Dragon Queen is a really excellent module for that. So if you're not entirely convinced that Hoard of the Dragon Queen is the right option for you, we do have some other suggestions. If you want something that's way more open-ended, more sandboxy, with much, much deadlier stakes, in a completely different setting from the Sword Coast, check out Tomb of Annihilation. You can find a review for that right over here.
And if you're looking for something a little bit easier to run, you can find our video on the Lost Mine of Fendelver right over here.
If you're looking to pick up any of these books, follow the links right below.
Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode.
Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
in the dungeon.